Okay, so we are live, and hello everybody, thanks for tuning in. Today we have Thomas Mical, Professor and Dean of Architecture. Thomas Mical is a Professor of Theory and Architecture. His lecture includes aspects of history of modern thought to decode and recode architectural theory, organization and effects reconsidered as processes and tactics. His agenda is to further understand the information and transition of subtle differences in spaces, conceived, perceived, and lived. The frequent research methodology pursues an X-Files like investigation of spatial curiosities within everyday late modern, hypermodern life. There are architectural conditions which should be parsed and for indications of the presence of other systems and forces at play. They are analyzed primarily through media philosophy and critical theory methodologies to identify visible and invisible forces shaping species of spaces. Species of spaces, I think it's correct. And I will say some of the publications that you have done and the research projects that are selected. In 2019, Urban Prototyping and Everyday Life. 2019 to present, Rise of Soft Machines, and publications such as forthcoming Architectural Theory, What Comes After Transparency, edited books with Wouter and Acker, Architecture and Ugliness, Series in Architecture, Multiplicity and Landscape Arrays, Glam Architecture Surfacing Desiring Machines, Magical and Mediated Transitional Urbanism in Kuala Manila, Nomad Science, and Mass Customization for Architecture Doctorates. It was a conference. Thank you for being here with us. And if you have anything to add, I will give you the mic now. You're muted now.
All right. Thank you so much for that introduction, and I'm very happy to be here. And hopefully people will find some of these issues that we're looking at today to be of interest. I do have a background in architectural theory, but as well in design studios, and I've also worked across the humanities fields as well. So I will often draw upon different theories and different ideas when I'm trying to explain some of the ideas and concepts that we're working through here in my association with universities in Silesia. So if it's okay, I'm going to just jump right in and start the presentation. So I think the technology gods have been appeased. This should work well. Okay, and we're in. Okay, and I'm sharing, I'm assuming? Okay.
Yes, everything's okay.
Okay, so welcome to the presentation. I'm going to talk a little bit about some aspects of pre and post industrialization in relationship to the formation of architectural space and the sensations associated with it. I start off here with an image of an obscure notebook, something that looks a bit like a schematic or wire diagram, circuitry perhaps. And it's actually a small but significant text that appears almost in passing in a science fiction film that called The Adjustment Bureau, which is based on a short story by the science fiction author Philip K. Dick. When I started studying architecture, I was a big fan of science fiction films, and I never quite separated the two, in the sense that designing architecture and designing for the future, for me, was often tied to the question of imaging, visualizing, anticipating future relationships, future technologies. The history of science fiction itself is often a history of warnings about technology or relationships between man and technology, and the increasing tendency of these technologies to override or overwrite the human situation. We have in this representation, if you know the film Adjustment Bureau, a group of watchers or observers that have this near angelic presence supervising the movements of humans and trying to either adjust the flow of time, either through blocking things or by accelerating things. It's based on a kind of a linear notion of time where time bifurcates in every moment, and you can have two or more options. So you can imagine that timelines as being decision trees, and the idea of multiple futures or parallel futures as something that we jump across in different configurations. So this image, which appears to be something of a wiring diagram or low-tech diagram, actually talks about a space-time continuum and a structural operation that has to do with preventing a couple from meeting, because once they meet, then the entire future changes. And having full consciousness of the future, the watchers try to intervene in it. The Adjustment Bureau is based on this idea of linear time and also the idea of parallel universes or multiple paths. And as a science fiction film, it actually goes very low on technology. Probably the only technology that seems to be of significance is the ability for people to go into a hidden dimension called the substrate by placing a special hat and going through one door and finding shortcuts, almost like wormholes or rabbit holes within the world that allow them to move from one space to another across normal distances quickly. The Adjustment Bureau is what it sounds like, the possibility that we can adjust our futures, and with conscious reflection and deliberate action, we can change the future path that we are on. This, in many ways, is the optimism and the promise of science fiction. So when did the world become so industrial? A more important question might be to ask, to what degree has the industrial fueled the human imagination? That is a much more provocative and I think productive conversation to have in the context of design, environment, not just architecture, my home discipline. So the industrial as a marker or as an indicator talks about a particular mode of production that in many ways becomes the structure from which ideological superstructure emanates. All types of cultural formations, according to classic Marxist theory, would tell us that everything that's an aspect of immaterial culture comes from the modes of production. I want to go back because we're just past the 100-year anniversary of the Bauhaus. And the Bauhaus holds a significant place in the history of architecture and design for many ways, probably a hyper-elevated position as a laboratory when it was conceived and developed, first of all, in the art school in Weimar by Walter Gropius in 1919, as an attempt to try to come to grips with industrialization. More precisely, as a questioning process, an investigation through making, returning to even some medieval modes of understanding spirituality and materiality, some medieval modes of representation, but focusing, if you know the bullseye diagram of the curriculum, on the idea of something that came to be known later as the total work of art. This integration of all aspects of the environment, everything from the smallest cup to the largest infrastructure, being united by a fusion of two very potentially different elements in society that formed a unity in much of the imagination of the Bauhaus as it developed. One was this reliance on abstraction, mathematical purity, ratio, harmony, that can be traced all the way back to Platonic idealism. The purification of mathematics and geometry, not as science per se, but as ideal, as the underlying structure or basis, the generative algorithms that allowed for industrialization to occur, to become efficient. Because as craft was replaced by machine through a very deliberate process of dismantling and reconfiguration, craft, in being subsumed in the machine culture, becomes a new type of not just tool, but mentality. Craft, as it is industrialized, becomes a very different set of operations and techniques, producing new environmental conditions, new details, new material opportunities. The brilliance of the first moves in the Bauhaus were the attempt to find a relationship between spirituality and materiality, simultaneously aligning craft and, even more importantly, its underlying geometries towards modes of production led to a perhaps inevitable conclusion that abstraction is the language of machines. And in this process of understanding abstraction as a tool, abstraction came to be studied as the content of the courses, not simply as its goal. Abstraction and the movement towards abstraction, whether it's through the textiles lab, through simple experiments in paper, hypothetical kiosk designs or poster, the Bauhaus curriculum was filled with opportunities for people to develop new languages of abstraction with the underlying potential and the obviously strong cultural undercurrent pulling everything towards industrialization, manufacturing, and, dare I say it, automation. The Bauhaus, in many ways, and here you can see the Dessau building from 1923, was a demonstration, a proof of concept of this idea that new modes of thinking and new cultural formations are not only possible, but are desirable when the imagination gets linked in that gap between craft and machine. The Bauhaus produced, as I said, multiple experiments, and it set up a situation as well for people to think about the opportunities available and also to speculate wildly about the future. Often the designs would grow from a one-on-one experiment. You would imagine the idea of scaling out towards the world from a particular moment, a particular detail, a particular material. Even a particular tool could be the generator of a new world. Within this approach, this almost fertile and obviously highly romanticized laboratory environment, experiments around abstraction and the scaffolding of different disciplines and subdisciplines from simple two-dimensional to three-dimensional to four-dimensional. All of these led to opportunities for students and faculty to experiment towards hypothetical futures, to develop not a language of the machine, but multiple languages, almost a Tower of Babel, perhaps, of different machine languages coming from different interpretations of that translation of craft into machinic processes. Abstraction became the guidance system, the tool, the criteria, and in many ways, the outcome of the experimentations that were done in the Bauhaus. And this is why I believe that the turn towards abstraction and pairing it with industrialization gave a powerful connection, almost a superpower, to the designers who are able to now conceive of different scales of production as well as different scales of making. We also have to keep in mind that it wasn't always purely mathematical, purely rational. The earliest experiments, I run from Kandinsky to Clegg, also Johannes Itten in particular, brought to the bear the questions of the spiritual, the invisible electronic hum of the universe. This is something that we know that even in the later lectures was something that Gropius struggled with, a purely machinic world without this spiritual hum. The idea of a blank surface or blank plane without any sort of spiritual connotations, which is also an element in the Steel elementarism, a world that empty and that quiet would probably be unlivable. So even in the realm of pure abstraction, there is room for the irrational, the imaginative, even enchantment. Developing a standard and developing a prototype became a powerful technique for design. In many ways, loose experimentation or the medieval heuristic of trial and error were refined and increasingly tempered by the possibility of handing parts of the processes over to machinic modes of production and to industry to disseminate and proliferate. As a consequence, many things that were often be designed were therefore increasingly decided. Design became something that was neither an art nor a science, but started to take on a very different set of methods and methodology consistent with this idea of world transformation. The transformations were small at first, the relationship of the body to space, of the body to texture, of the fundamental element like a piece of furniture and how that could create an environment within an environment. Are all things that are quite obvious now in retrospect, looking at the Bauhaus experimentation, when at the time, as I'm arguing, abstraction was the emerging language and also the emerging goal of this pedagogy. We can see in this case, there's plenty of examples, surviving examples of some of the fundamental experiments using very simple forms, using a vocabulary of modern materials, reduced and stripped down to their absolute elementarist or singular topological configurations. Materiality became just one of many attributes you could ascribe to a construction, to an assemblage. It's a different mentality, obviously, than the medieval or even the Enlightenment period, where in the Bauhaus, materiality was a device amongst other devices that could be hot swappable or exchangeable with other materials within formal languages. The disseparation was quite explicit, I think, to use the example of glass. Historically, glass was crafted and could only operate at a certain scale. It had a fragility to it. With the development of float glass and the ability to make great panes of glass windows, storefront windows, and other hypothetical glass structures became imaginary, then possible, then became commonplace. This is something, for example, Walter Benjamin in his Arcades projects talks about excessively, that the development of one single technology produces a wider technicity, to use Stiegler's term, to describe this extension of one technology into the intangible culture, the development of window shopping, and the growth of a different type of nomadic middle class, all transformed urbanism from the idea of the storefront window. That story is well known, but also lesser known and underexamined is the use of transparency and translucency as fundamental material conditions and fundamental colors in many of the Bauhaus experiments, especially those studios that were done by Moholy-Nagy and others, where the idea of using light and light as a tool, again, a very medieval or spiritual idea, gets transformed into a type of anticipation or premonition of what came to be known as mechanized seeing. This displacement of the eye into the machine and displacement of the machine's authoritarian or architectural judgment device, the guidance mechanism that lenses and eyes give us in his later works and his photograms is abandoned entirely to different forms of composition, short-circuiting, as it were, the conventional process of designing, not to make things faster and cheaper, but to design things in such a way that the distance between the abstraction and the result are minimized. We can find here, for example, in one of the studio projects of many countless fascinating studies from Albers, a different type of rhythm, a different type of pattern emerging from a simple crossing or a simple detail. This is the idea topologically of scaling up from a one-to-one detail or from one intersection and turning it into a new fabric or a new world. In many ways, this talks about a top-down approach towards rethinking and restructuring the environment as it is, incorporating obviously the industrial anticipation, but also something of a utopian tendency. The purity of geometry we find in Plato and other idealist philosophers, the over-reliance in, say, Cartesian thinking towards a geometric method gives rise to the possibility of this rational assemblage or rational construction that becomes a proliferation, an endless extension of different joints repeating and arraying themselves into self-similar or slightly differentiated patterns. And it's worthwhile to also look at Albers and his development of the color wheel in the context of this, that the photons of light and their frequency are very different than the three axes used nowadays in the color wheel that he developed as a way of thinking about the possibility of even light itself being something that is infinitely arrayable and configurable as an environment building device. Something that, for example, when Marshall McLuhan says every light bulb creates its own environment is anticipated in the post-war period of media theory. So you can find traces of emergent media theory and post-industrialization even in the earliest of Bauhaus student experiments if you look closely. The modern world that was anticipated based on this was an interesting dialogue or debate perhaps between not just the ancients and the moderns recycled into studio politics, but more precisely the question of propriety. And I would say that as perhaps a reactionary comment, having to do with industrialization. We know that jokingly in architecture firms, we always say it takes just as much work to do a bad project as a good project. But in fact, the criteria, particularly the idea of performance criteria, tied into industrialization, tied into modes of manufacturing production, requires something like a prototyping system. A trial and error system is probably not as efficient as something where there's more explicit criteria and then attempts to satisfy those criteria and then evaluating and testing them. So perhaps there was some rational way to bring all of these things together that involves something other than a Bauhaus pedagogy or a Bauhaus methodology. But we have to admire, in particularly the furniture designs, all of these amazing and sensuous and captivating options that came out of this permutation of different possibilities. There are an infinite number of possible chairs that all emanate in the Platonic model from the idea of a universal chairness. And yet at the same time, the uniqueness of each chair also talks about that shared typology, that shared morphology perhaps of its constituent parts. And the chairs themselves also, as they are developed and refined over time, start to speak in a world that's perhaps even more explicitly phenomenological, the anticipation of seating, the situation of repose of the body, the slight shifting of the relationships between the muscles and the body mass in the flexibility or the rigidity of the different details. The design of a chair in many ways is a polemic that is similar to the pavilion in being an essay form of architecture. The chair and the chair tectonics are the most minimal and the most abstracted version of the larger question of industrial production of everything in the environment. And so chair design in particular is a worthwhile area to investigate in terms of the design processes that are being developed in the Bauhaus, in their anticipation of the body occupying them, in their anticipation of the eye evaluating and judging them, and also in their ability to anticipate modes of production and increasingly efficiencies coming through scale and practice. Let's jump ahead and talk a little bit about my hometown here, if we could. Jumping back to Chicago, it's well known that after the Bauhaus was closed a second time in Germany, that Mies van der Rohe and others decamped to the United States. And it was the city of Chicago where something like a new Bauhaus was formed in an existing, somewhat industrial working class city, a city that was explicitly modern, having been rebuilt after the Great Fire in the 1870s. Chicago was the city that developed, in many ways, some advanced engineering techniques that gave the opportunity for the Bauhaus emigres two generations later, to move beyond the golden age of Chicago's modern architecture, the development of the skyscraper, the reversal of the flow of the Chicago River, the elevated trains. Great number of technological accomplishments happened in Chicago as a laboratory. But for Mies, Hilbersheimer, Moholy-Nagy, and the others who relocated, many of them found within Chicago a strange wonderland, the possibility of both the realization of some of the earlier Bauhaus and industrialized ideals, and a place that was in some ways completely devoid of some of the experiments and the context that generated those earlier fantasies and premonitions too. So in a way, it was a type of environment that was conflicted in the sense that it had precedents, it had traditions, it had a particular tempo and feel to it. It was a modern city by all accounts, a rapidly growing city up until the Great Depression. And as a consequence, the building culture in Chicago has followed not just the boom and bust cycles that we find in the economy, but in some ways also created periods of lag. And these lag periods were used by some designers and some architects as time to not just reflect, but to speculate on the future too. So when construction is slow, designers get imaginative. And we know everything from Daniel Burnham's work on the vision of Chicago for future Chicago and its ghost-like influence on contemporary design, even though most of it wasn't built. We can also think of Mies's vision of a modernized Chicago and the small instances and moments and tactical insertions of some significant projects and works by Mies, and a larger number of insertions by his former students and admirers created an aesthetic all its own in Chicago, the stripped down minimalism. We're looking at a project, the Inland Steel Building, made almost entirely of steel and designed in some ways to follow those Miesian principles of universal space with everything from the minimalized but highly stylized details of the exoskeleton to the open floor plate to the floor to ceiling glazing that allows you to see the horizon. Many of the techniques that were pioneered in Mies's approach towards post-war industrialized architecture find a new language here in this contemporary reinterpretation of that. It's one of the larger buildings, I think one of the first tall office buildings built after World War II. This image is a little bit blurry, but it's a vintage representation of the fundamental challenge of design. And that is working from that one-to-one scale and thinking in real time and at real scale and anticipating future types of construction. The efficiency comes from the repetition. And we know that repetition itself is a very powerful tool in the hands of designer, almost a default methodology in industrialization. This repetition of things in a series that doesn't tolerate difference, that anticipates endlessness, repetition when it shows up in serialism in music, for example, or the repetition that teaches us how to memorize and learn things and is an important part of ritual. Repetition in many ways is a foundational component of automation. And you could even say in the surrealist mode as a type of automatism, a kind of walking on autopilot or producing and manufacturing ad nauseum from those original decisions. So in many ways, like making a film script, an architectural drawing becomes a type of imaginary site or imaginary scene where all of the dramas and all of the tensions play themselves out in the process of drafting or drawing or constructing, hypothetically, the three-dimensional joints. And then once that joint is designed and resolved, it becomes arrayed and proliferated throughout the three-dimensional volume to form something like the skeletal joints or skeletal connections for the building. This approach, which obviously you can see in a lot of modern architects who are following the Miesian approach, starts with that one-to-one detail, grows into a repetitive system, and that repetitive system becomes a built abstraction. You can see, for example, in the schematic floor plan here for the steel building, there's no internal structure. There's a clear diagrammatic separation between space that is service space and space that is leasable square footage. And as you can see there, the diagrammatic purity follows from this idea of the grid. Something almost basilica-like in its simplicity and its use of ribs on the exterior, the compactness of the core and its diagrammatic separation, its non-ceremonial location, neither at the ends nor in the middle, but just off of the center, tells us also about this move away from hierarchy and a fondness for L-shaped spaces that create a type of rotation and axial intersections that are soft, fuzzy, and loose. This is a type of very pristine geometry and a highly engineered building at the time that creates a hypothetically flexible, nondescript, and mono or non-functionalist space. It is a space that could be quite generic and subdivided and used in a variety of ways. So we have there this interesting contrast of a skin taking on a very different characterization than, say, this internal space. It's like a body without organs, where there's just this free-floating movement of different particles of light, pollen, and all of the functional opportunities occur in an environment that, at least in its raw state here, is unscripted and unchoreographed. It is a generic architecture on the inside and a hyper-specified skeletal system or skin condition on the outside, something like a high-performance vehicle with no internal seating or configurations. Now, the office itself would actually be used in a very different way than we see in this diagrammatically pure plan. The office itself is actually a focusing environment. It's a place to sit. Here you can see one of the architecture firms taking advantage of the open span, the dropped ceiling, one of the signifiers of corporate America, as a relentless grid, almost like a different type of landscape up above, creates these situations, these environments where the spatial compression is being created horizontally in a building that's got a vertical expression of its structure. This is something we can find again as a three-dimensional joinery system going back to the earliest Bauhaus experiments, and this, I guess, not just acknowledgement, but almost this enthrallment with automation, with industrialization, with abstraction, gives rise to these incredibly pristine environments that are designed to high degrees of precision to produce not just aesthetic effects, but to create an environment that, you know, nowadays would be considered to be something like a clean space, a space that is devoid of disruption, difference, of contest, of conflict, or any sort of interruption. It is a space that demands a particular response from humans and all their sloppy, messy political interactions. And it is a space that also says with authority, we are all watching each other. This sort of open span space realizes perhaps some of the positive and negative fantasies of Bruno Taut and his architectural glass fantasies from the early 20th century that influenced Gropius and others, with this idea of the space without hiding environments, the space with no dark corners, the space devoid of anything like crime or subterfuge, in this wishful dream of a purely transparent, efficient world. You can see how that approach towards modernity, in particular corporate modernism and bureaucratization in the late 20th century, transfigured not just the environments where architects work, but transfigured their understanding of their place in the firm and the firms themselves as they become more corporate, subdivide into different departments, and mimic and take on the characteristics of other types of corporations. All of this is anticipated, I would argue, in those first moves of pairing abstraction with industrialization in the Bauhaus. There's a contemporary shot of the interior showing you how things have changed and not changed from some of the Bauhaus aspirations of environmental integration of the different arts. Let's jump biographically to another part of the world, Florida. This is the House of the Future. I believe this is the California one, although there's a second Disney World that was built in Florida, which is the one I used to go to as a small child all the time. And this is a design of a House of the Future that is made pretty much out of plastic, fantasy material back then as well, roughly contemporaneous with the inland steel building, but obviously not in an urban environment and obviously not burdened with the expectations of the legacies of I guess, historically informed modernity. Here we have the idea of something almost moving the other direction towards a media theory, a television-driven culture based on advertisement, lifestyle, and rapid consumption as opposed to rapid production techniques. The House of Tomorrow, if we look at the interior, has both a interesting retro feel, but also a strong acknowledgement of that, not the mid-century modern aesthetic per se, but that total work of art environmental approach where different elements of the interior are brought together compositionally to create a continuous space. The smooth space, or the space with minimal turbulence, is a parallel, not identical, but a parallel to that Miesian space that we saw being articulated in a lot of the works of Chicago, where one seating area, one working area, the television area, all of the different discrete little micro programmings you would have in a building of a domestic scale get brought together in a way that is neither domestic nor is it managerial. There's a different type of space hovering somewhere between, I would argue, and composed of different modular elements, a combination of different components and materials with plastic and plastic type reproductions of other materials, particularly textiles, creating this environment that anticipates and operates also in resonance with the space age. So we have domesticity being displayed here as a type of consumable spectacle, the fantasy of consumption and all of the aspects of that consumer culture about status and having the most up-to-date technology, which you can find now, persistent and consistent upgrades of all of our digital media. Back then anticipated in the time where things became quite inexpensive deliberately through mass production. There is an equation also happening at this time that's well known between mass production and mass media, that one cannot operate without the other. And we find that happening in very subtle ways through all of these different speculative designs of houses for the future. You can find, for example, references to modes of communication within the dwelling that are not possible in conventional, say, Victorian houses. Everything to do with clear lines of sight and echo coming through the materiality, to the use of intercoms and other communication systems inside and outside. And back then in the 50s, the fantasy of a video visual telephone. The space age, as it came to be called, is an aspect or an offshoot of modernity, and it takes on a very interesting, narrowing of bandwidth of possibilities in the case of North America in the prosperous time of the early Cold War. There's a very different trajectory that is followed in, for example, the Soviet Union in their space age. Everything from the aesthetics to the lifestyles that are being promoted as a consequence of this rapidly technologizing society is something that we see happening in very discrete ways. The industrialization of the kitchen, argued to be a consequence of trying to move women from the post-war environments of factories back into the domestic, so that the men returning from the war can take their factory jobs back, to the idea that a highly technological future would be available to most. Nowadays, we read everything from class markers and biases, cultural assumptions, and racial codes, perhaps, into some of these representations in the popular press and the technology-oriented magazines. But the idea that society and culture operates and plays itself out through interior spaces in some sort of explicit dialogue with the exterior is transformed also in post-war America with the translation of the plate glass window into the large frame windows that we find in a lot of mid-century modern ranch and other houses too. Here you can see that fantasy being extended, where the family is living right at the lower level of their swimming pool, watching their children scuba diving, as it were, in an environment that is filled with all of the trappings and all of the conventions of a tasteful and comfortable lifestyle, the upper middle class. And something that was also, as again, posited as something attainable if one follows particular choices in life and has certain opportunities presented to them. You can find a variation of this, and I'm doing this as a type of visual pun, and back in the context of Chicago as well. If we look at the layout of the Farnsworth house, Mies van der Rohe's well-known modification of something like a trailer home morphology. At the time of manufactured homes were quite substandard. Mies took the ideas of this structural exoskeleton, which he had demonstrated in Crown Hall and some other works, and applied it to the very small scale for Mrs. Farnsworth. The building is quite significant and using a lot of conventional techniques for Mies that were quite different from his avant-garde work back in Germany. It's been noted by many scholars his classicizing tendency after he came to America. And if you look at those two catalogs, Mies in America and Mies in Berlin, I think it's highlighted in much of the quality scholarship in those texts about just how different those contexts were. Here, the industrialization and the idea of the middle-class lifestyle, the home away from home. This is a retreat situated in a forest or a forest-like setting outside of Chicago, as a total home environment filled with the devices that quite close to Mies's original sensitivity, but organized in a way that has not just bilateral symmetry, but strong references to endings and enclosure. Even the single wall inside the dwelling itself, which you can see there, wood paneled as the hearth on one side and as the kitchen on the other side, is quite radically different than a lot of Frank Lloyd Wright's work, which is also pioneered and developed in the same city and region, where the hearth in a Semper-like way anchors the house. Here, the hearth is incidental, as is most of the furniture. It has a lightness or a transposability, a transitive quality of many of the spaces, but the symmetries are quite strong and the balance is quite strong in the micro scale as well. So here we have Mies creating moments of symmetry and moments of balance within an environment that is increasingly balanced itself in response to the surrounding context, which is quite irregular natural landscape. Here you can see a representation of the house. This is relatively contemporary, and it's not a photograph, it's actually a simulation, digital simulation of architecture, and particularly this is an example. I'm always fascinated when I see this, that is more real than real, the hyperreal condition where the representation becomes in many ways not just controlled, but modified in such a way that can be comfortably assumed by the eye. The uncanny valley is closed off here and presents us with a pure spectacle, almost like an Ur memory or the prototype of the Farnsworth house in all of its pristine Eden-like glory. Let's talk a little bit more about another permutation of industrialization in the Eames house, the case study house, one of many done in also mid-century in the United States. The project is perhaps a very clear anticipation of modular homes. Even I would argue you could see the do-it-yourself IKEA tectonics in a subtle way happening here as well. That logical extension of thinking from the joint or from the detail, from the one-to-one world to a larger scale, to creating planes, planes creating bounded volumes, the volumes becoming in many ways a three-dimensional assemblage, are all taken to an extreme here, where the kit of parts approach, which you can find all the way back to certainly to Paxton's Crystal Palace, but that idea of the modern technology moving away from craftsmanship towards assembly on site. Here, the case study house is a study not just of minimalism, but the development of a particular interior and domestic aesthetic that plays on that boundary between the industrial and I would say the cozy. Here we have something where the boundaries of the individual elements can often be very clearly defined, and their overall participation, the syncopation of different rhythms of grids and lighting used instead of ornament, and again, all following some predetermined modules and modes of construction. All of the panes of glass, for example, following a different module. This has been intended and designed as something that demonstrates its process of creation or process of construction. There is no real hiding in the sense of concealing methods of joinery, nor is there a celebration of them. They're almost presented as facts, as almost a naturalization of what is quite unnatural, which is highly technically mediated building components brought together and assembled into an environment that is intended to undercut some of the expense associated with modes of production, and at the same time produce a generous variety of spaces, potentially good and useful for domestic activities, but also because of their discrepancy or difference from some of the conventional and reactionary housing available at the time. By turning away from nostalgia and away from history, this is also a type of imperative, a challenge to find a new lifestyle that matches the architecture. Much of what happens in the case study house here
Each of these elements probably has a genealogy that can be traced back to the early 20th century or earlier. In the same way, you can also think about the embodied energy and embodied material that went into the making of each of these elements as they're brought to the site too. So what is sacrificed in terms of, I guess, energy was intended to pay off in terms of the financial cost. But it doesn't take into account also the social and psychological consequences of living in some of these houses too, which is neither a positive nor a negative, but again, it's just a mutation in development of repetitive automation towards something that allows for differentiation and something that allows for variety to occur within some very tight constraints. We can see the facade itself organized and subdivided into different panels and systems, creating the appearance of a maybe like a Lego kit, that different parts could be swapped out with each other. Over time, you can imagine that certain areas could become replaced. Transparent can become opaque, opaque can become transparent. Even imaginary systems of inside and outside boundaries can be reconfigured along and across the structural frame. This approach, which has more to do with greenhouses and utility sheds, by being applied to the domestic scale, creates almost an industrial loft. At the same time, it creates a pavilion, and at the same time, it also creates a residence. So this blurring of typological boundaries and cultural codes is also part of the fascination and the experimentation, I believe, that was driving the Eames in their work. The elements themselves, if you look at it, speak very clearly of that process of repetition and the fundamental basis of structure as a bilateral symmetry. And then the configuration of the spaces for human movement and activity, the mediation of light through these screen conditions, not curtain walls, but I would call them screens. All of these are different types of permutations or I guess a clustering as opposed to linear repetition, a clustering of different spaces and a clustering of different systems along the boundaries, the internal and external seams, creates this environment that is both dynamic as well as controlled. And that's a hard balance to achieve, particularly if we look at it in terms of scale. There's some very tiny spaces and there's some quite generous spaces too, all interacting within this environment in a very deliberately controlled experiment. Nature has a place around it, but not inside it. The building stands in opposition to the conventional site-built home, but is fully conscious and aware of it as an alternative. This is a vision of a future that is still being formatted and still being delivered. And we can see some of the successes here, even percolating down to the tiny homes movement today. If we look at the space planning, we can see something of the efficiency of the design of in the aerospace industry. We can see the simplicity of designs for, say, railroad carriages or yachts. There is something closer to nautical engineering than to conventional space planning in the Victorian sense, happening in the subdivision and the modularity of these different programmatic elements. The standardized kit of parts and that idea of efficiency coming from repetition are still embedded, but we also have spaces of difference. We have major and minor axes, we have rotations, and we have a visual interlocking, again, of a clustered organizational system that produces a range of different degrees of privacy. It is an environment that also welcomes, in some ways, modifications, additions, translations, transformations. It is a flexible space that is intended to be modified over time in the same way that the building itself anticipates or at least telegraphs its capacity to be modified. Its modular nature is something that is given as a structure, but that itself is also something that could be extended in different dimensions as well. So here we have space taking more of an abstraction nature itself, of being a volume or a composition of voids organized and distributed through a larger shell. The other case study houses are more grounded, I would argue, and they follow more of the conventions of traditional upper middle class and upper class housing. Here, for example, overlooking all of the lights of Santa Monica, as if one were occupying a special place above the city, levitating, hovering, circulating by helicopter. All of these lines of sight are anticipated in this cantilevered condition. Let's talk about the automobile culture for a minute, because it's probably one of the most important undercurrents in the development of American post-war and mid-century modern architecture, the proliferation of automobiles and the dominance of cities eventually under the control of the fantasy of an automobile-oriented world. There's obviously great risk associated with that today. There's a lot of attempts and work to be done on what a post-peak oil future would look like and how to re-inhabit different parts of the built environment, particularly sprawl and exurbia, in relationship to the generative tool and potential that we saw of the automobile. It was Frank Lloyd Wright, I believe, who observed over 100 years ago, watch out for that small gas station. It will transform the cities. That's a bad paraphrase, but you know what I'm talking about in terms of the development of the autotopia that America, and particularly the non-historical parts of America, meaning most of the Midwest and West, where modernity and urbanization came later in America's development. And there's much more free range and expression of mid-century modern techniques. Here you can see Sheridan's headquarters for General Motors, talking again about that very similar industrialized Bauhaus assemblage model. And also you can start to see the stylistic conceits that play out in the development of the American automobile as a commodity item or consumer fetishist fantasy. The relationship between the inside and the outside of the architecture, the idea that spaces are either functional spaces or movement spaces, developed and taken to a high degree of articulation here, even in the panel systems and the scale, the use of the different technological framing systems, the plates of glass that become one amongst many and lose their transparency into almost a continuous reflective surface. All of these are techniques we find in modern architecture being refined and elaborated and proliferated to the point where glass itself becomes just some indexical reference to transparency and doesn't offer transparency in its proper sense, at least through the depths of the layers of glass buildings. Let's look to this, return to this aesthetic, and you can start to see, particularly in the Ezra Stoller photographs, which are most of the black and white ones I'm using, the treatment of lighting and contrast to create this almost uniform, hygienic space, perhaps like the end sequence in Kubrick's 2001, showing this radiated and illuminated utopian world where the fantasies of mathematical idealism and purity, technological automobile-driven utopias, all fused together into something that is both a everyday reality and a type of very, very deeply entrenched fantasy for many. It is very typical to think of our spaces, and here you can see this is a designer showroom showing more about how you design than actually design production. And as a studio space here, it also speaks of the fact that the building itself is designed to be photographed and designed to be consumed optically in the same way that automobiles might be. They anticipate optically the haptic touch, the haptic gesture, and the types of abstractions that get built into the automobile are, in this case, somewhat concealed, whereas in architecture, they're made manifest and left at the surface as a clear reference in that modernist technique of revealing the process of making. When you replace craftsmanship with assembly, and by placing the surfaces in an unadorned or uncovered way, it calls attention to how the thing was put together. And good architects, particularly a lot of modern architects, would favor the negative detailing, the subtractive gap joined to reveal with fasteners exposed that show exactly how things are put together, something you would never do in the automobile itself. So that schism or the dichotomy between expressionism of tectonics in modern architecture and high modern or late modern architecture here is at odds with the concealment of the technology that is developing the automobile industry. They are not in alignment in this case, and that tension between them is quite explicit, particularly in these photographs. It doesn't always matter in terms of the shape of a building, where the orientation or the system, your internal GPS, your wayfinding abilities, your cognitive map building facilities, your psychic encounter or psychological encounter with the built environment is often based on understanding placement in terms of relationships to boundaries and to nodes and to certain landmark type operations. You can imagine a different type of architecture built on rotations, built on displacement, built on temporarily holding a territory, but not actually having fixed walls and enclosed spaces. Yeah, it leans towards openness and open space, the open plan, even open access design, The universal space, as they've accused Mies and others of making, is based on this idea of free movement and for openness as a extensive or mostly horizontal condition. And yet we find in Saarinen's work and many others too, a almost devout adherence to abstract geometries as generators. And here you can see the concentric circles that would have been used to develop this design being manifested in the configuration and layout of the different utilitarian and core spaces as they are dispersed through this large disk. The disk itself and the project, the General Motors headquarters, has a lot of fascinating devices, almost in a way you could say, are like mannerisms or nervous tics that individual designers fetishize. Here, notice, for example, the idealism of the stairs as they've been built, the desk system itself, which looks like some sort of new Apple product, and the reference to, again, that open planning subdivision of space that we find in, say, going back to Mises' Barcelona Pavilion there too. In this cylindrical showroom, we start to see also the power of architecture as it is transformed imaginatively as a tool of advertising or as a, I guess, an avatar of cultural production itself. The distinction between marketing, advertising, branding in the automobile, which is crucial for the survival of the companies, as a kind of off-gassing into the architecture itself. And this is something that Saarinen captured and knew quite well. You can contrast this approach with, say, some of the designs of showrooms like BMW headquarters and others done in contemporary times using some advanced digital graphics and, I guess, generative coding to create dynamic forms, whereas here the original car designs were still done with clay models and wind tunnels. In some ways, the architecture is more technologically sophisticated than the automobiles, but in many ways, the automobiles themselves and the visual culture and the intangible culture of the automobile is far more pervasive and influential than the architecture of this period is too. It's not simply a debate between corporate modernism or neo-Victorian domesticity, but an entire spectrum of possibilities tends to bunch up or be closely aligned to that either one or other end of the spectrum. And what you have is exaggerations at the endpoints. The minimalist projects increasingly become more minimal, but they also start to grow in scale. The seamlessness, which recalls a monumentality lost in some of the early works of modern architecture, and you can think of Loos and early Corbu against monumentality, and the resurfacing of monumentality through this new language of modern architecture is a fascinating condition in American automobile culture and the space age. Here you can see the contemporary use of that space as well. It's a space that obviously is not just a showroom, but talks about a particular lifestyle and aesthetic that are tied to the cult status of the automobile. So one of the things that happens in modernity is the unnatural becomes natural. The most radical of technologies become not just domesticated, but become parts of our everyday life and habitus. Here, this is one of the shortest runways in the Caribbean, showing a typical experience of bathers encountering a primeval condition of wading into the sea and the arrival of the next airplane full of very wealthy tourists. And it's a photograph of millions that captures a particular moment in, I guess, the history of the 20th century, not as a contrast, but actually as a symmetry. The consumer culture and this tendency towards the off-gassing, I called it, of advanced design from fields like car design, product design, fashion design into architecture is a fascinating reversal of polarities, because in the Bauhaus, the discipline that pulled everything together was architecture, but you would apprentice through the other different subsystems and crafts before you were able to develop architectural propositions. Here, I'm arguing that architects were increasingly expected to, through the media culture and the consumer culture that fostered it, to have buildings that were not just well designed or well made, but also captured those aesthetic markers of lifestyle. In many ways, high-performing buildings were not only structurally high-performing, but also culturally high-performing. As you can see here in the well-known TWA terminal, which if you do get to go to New York and you get stranded overnight like I did, is also a hotel now, so you can enjoy it if you're an architectural historian or someone inclined to staying in rooms that don't have hard 90-degree corners. The terminal follows the idea of different types of movements and flow. It's got a particular geometry, I think, that is captivating as well as it's difficult to reproduce. It was developed and intended to be built out of concrete, but to mimic the flights of birds, airfoils that obviously work on a lift and drag coefficient that the architecture didn't really have to achieve. And it also has that sense of openness to it. Also, there's a bunch of encounter spaces created through the regular but non-orthogonal geometries. In some ways, it's very much like a large habitat with smaller habitats designed within it based on different types of lines of sight and movement systems. It also, like Misa's later work, has a classical symmetry to it, strong ends, strong thresholds, balance between opposites. If we look at the drawings themselves, we can admire them for their draftsmanship. We can also admire the thinking that would go behind the iterative process that would take us to this sort of conclusion. There's a type of architecture that is inherently three-dimensional that resists any sort of precise capture in two dimensions, and that is part of its appeal and charm and also the level of difficulty. It is said that mannerism arose by many art historians after the perfection of the rules of the Renaissance, not out of boredom or fatigue, but in an attempt to move things to a higher level of difficulty. And we can see that happening here when many of the avatars and many of the tells and devices we associate with mid-century modern architecture are taken to a higher level of performance expectation. The curvatures, the alignments, the displacements, the intersection of different systems, all of these move beyond conventional gridded orthogonal systems into very well thought out and three-dimensional biomorphic forms, loosely informed by natural analogy, but also informed by the highly artificial nature of the aerospace industry and particularly its fuselage cultures. As you see in this drawing or this representation of the interior space as it was modified, the interior and the exterior, the process of movement, where movement systems, structural systems, and closure systems start to step out of their pages. They step out of their boxes and they start to transpose themselves into each other. It is something that goes against that systematic approach and moves into something where the overlaps and the junctures become more like moments of turbulence you would find in an airplane, where inside and outside, where straight and curved, where opaque and transparent are not binaries, but they go through this slow process of swapping each other, more like a parallax, where one planet or one celestial body will pass behind or appear behind a different one, only to reemerge later in its original position. So a lot of these slips and these slides and these not glitches, but these well-designed moments appear and are manifest three-dimensionally and only constructed or reconstructed using a type of descriptive geometry back into two dimensions. So the technique of drawing was not the generator exclusively for the architecture. Because of those discrepancies, we can know that the architect's imagination and their ability to visualize three-dimensionally and to conceive of space, as you see here, as something that's both sculpted as well as assembled, is something that is a gift in many ways. It's an ability that's teachable, but not really self-available or even innate in some designers. And so I would argue that Saarinen work, particularly in this terminal, is a higher degree of difficulty. And as a consequence, it also requires a higher degree of intellect or cognitive skills to not only be able to imagine it, but to represent it with such precision that it could be constructed. And we know in the process of designing a building, and every student said this, that there's always a gap between what was anticipated and expected and what results. This, in many ways, points towards a possibility of a significant idealism, particularly a geometrical idealism, driving a lot of architectural work, particularly through the 20th century. Even with the modernist architects, not en masse, but in many different ways, in many different languages, moving against the constraints and the coded language of the Beaux-Arts neoclassicism, we can still find traces of that. If nowhere else, then in the scale of the body as it moves through space. The touching of the foot on the stairs, the hand on the handrail, all of these markers of the human body have not been totally evacuated from this architecture. We cannot call it yet a post-humanist architecture, but it certainly is an architecture that is leaning towards that space age or that aerospace industry and that idea of a world as increasingly not just automated, but efficient. And in that way, it ties into a lot of utopian principles and even some of the science fiction films that hopefully we'll be able to talk about soon. A much clearer image showing you again those types of graceful movements and flow, where the process of the ambulatory process of promenade and movement through space becomes something that is experienced as well as a performative operation for others. There are backdrops, there are foregrounds, there are depth of field slips and isolations here. A pretty sophisticated optic, if we look and examine it very closely, operating within these large swooping shells that canvas and tent the entire space. When I was a kid, these are the kinds of futures we thought we would have. I was promised hover bikes as a young boy. I'm still waiting for those to show up on Amazon. But if we look at the representations going back to, Popular Mechanics, sometimes Time Life magazine, other journals would occasionally hire the industrial designers to render their visions of the future. We can see here in the foreground, I believe this is from the 1950s, a vehicle, self-driving vehicle. It's got video conferencing available. And you can sit there and have a nice picnic with your family in your car. We've got those. Look behind it at the architecture. You can see an occupied sphere. You can see something that looks like a terraforming device spewing oxygen into the environment. These vast Blade Runner type images of corporate towers. We're still working on that part of this projected future. This highway system too reminds me a bit of the expressways outside of all the major American cities. Again, let's look at the contrast in terms of that autotopia or the vehicle culture and the architectural technologies. The fantasy of the middle-class family coming home in the early 21st century. You can see that the mother, in a conventional caretaking mode, has taken her daughter out shopping with the family dog and brought back the groceries in a paper bag, and she's looking for a place to land her hover car. You can see that the father and his small boy are confined to the ground plane and obviously very confused about where dinner is in a house that is obviously dated from the 1950s and hasn't really moved beyond that too. So the styles of fashion and the cycles of fashion that occur in the fashion industry, the automobile industry, and the home design industry are never quite in sync. And unlike in works of Saarinen, where it's a sophisticated transposition of the different systems, here what we see is just a shock juxtaposition of different moments of time in the same rendering. Something that science fiction film often gives us, where certain elements of the present are sustained and other elements of the present are extended or exaggerated into the future. It gives an argument that their time machines probably won't be workable even in the distant future, because only one component or one element of a scene can be operating in the present for something else to operate in the future. But that's a pet theory I have that I still need to develop. If we look at Japanese metabolism, which is a fascinating area for me, having worked as a salaryman and an architect in Tokyo for a couple summers, and I did my master's thesis looking at downtown Shinjuku in Tokyo as an urban location. The metabolist movement in the 50s and 60s was based on equating oceanic typologies and particularly organic analogs of sea creatures into possible modes of habitation and dwelling. Here in the case of Marine City, an actual floating city intended to operate with what at that time wasn't understood, the rising seas. This is Nat Chard's work. It's his Ph.D. by project from the UCL Bartlett, where he developed a series of studies through model form. And it's the idea that you can do design research not simply by drawing or by text, but also think about prototyping and working through a bunch of the other forms, including some detritus and recycled pieces. This is a favorite technique I have, and then perhaps in a different lecture, I'll show people some of the studio work we've done, where most of the modeling that we've done has been done primarily as the testing and the prototyping of the ideas that only are secondarily manifest in the compositions, conceptual models, and the creative acts of assemblage to give rise to these urban propositions. The films that were perhaps the most, interesting to me as a small child were the films that pointed towards other worlds and things different than the comfort of middle-class American suburbia during the late space age. Blade Runner was one of the first to actually cause me to change my understanding of the world. After I saw this movie in a movie theater and walked out to a big empty parking lot, I decided at that point I was going to look for places that were more like Blade Runner to live. And that led me on a lifetime itinerary, moving to places like Tokyo, Shanghai, Auckland, a variety of other cities too, and currently here in Delhi, India, all in a search for these highly saturated, high density environments where we have certain forces of the future, but also certain retroactive visions of the future appearing in a nostalgic sense. So this condition, this environment doesn't follow from that mid-century logic. It represents a period in the 80s and 90s where science fiction films turned dark at the end of the Cold War as it became overheated, and the development of a globalized economy, which started to create moments of financial insecurity and destabilization. It's like the acceleration of the different forces at play once they were let loose and abandoned the modernist fantasy of a utopian closure, a teleological end. Once utopia became foreclosed or unavailable, the dystopian took on a particularly not just sinister and menacing, but pervasive aspect in the films of this period. Just a quick flash of some film stills from the left on Blade Runner, and then my final project where I was looking at how to use infrastructure and imagining, as many people do, that if we once we get the correct infrastructure in our imaginations, once we can imagine a super infrastructure that can solve all possible problems, it's like this almost ghost in the machine fantasy of a deus ex machina coming down and salvaging derelict or decrepit urbanism. That became the basis for my attempt to redesign parts of downtown Tokyo using found and leftover industrial objects, infrastructure, architectural components as a type of combination or combine, to use the contemporary philosophy concept of recombinant, but also the idea of a type of theoretical combining of different elements from different time periods into a synthesis. We can see a turn towards utopia again, resurfacing almost like a transient reappearance or a ghost image of utopia after that dystopian period. Increasingly, the utopias of the science fiction films and film in general, pointing towards the future, start to look more and more like the high-tech architecture that was developed in the period before the dystopian 80s and 90s. It's an after image. It's not a pure expression of some of the things that we saw in the works of Saarinen or SOM or even Mies or the Bauhaus. But in many ways, it's a type of apparition, not a premonition of a future, but a nostalgic recall of the purity of the past resurfacing as technological mediation of the present. We have here in the Dubai Hotel, for example, the terraforming of the world. The logo of the hotel becomes also the sculpting of the sand and the embankments and the property sites themselves. And in the last few minutes we have, I'll just talk about how in many of the science fiction films that were developed in the late 20th century and early 21st century, there is a return towards a deep speculation about the future. And in the future, in many of these films, there's a consistent message of not just corporate hegemony, but the ubiquity of not just computing and sensing, but almost this idea of a fully integrated and automated world where humans are no longer necessary except perhaps as janitorial members. This collective anxiety about pure automation or about the realization of the utopia that has no place for humanism is in many ways the post-human situation, the post-human condition. The recognition that, as Foucault pointed out in his Order of Things, that man is no longer at the center of the table, matrix, or array used to evaluate and to understand the world, that man as an entity, as a force in these science fiction films is placed at the margin and placed in a position of not being the apex predator, but is in some other undecided or covert situation. And you can find within science fiction films in particular, the aesthetic of many of these films has also started to converge. In the same way, it's been argued that experimental music in the 60s and 70s gave rise to increasingly homogenized, acceptable pop music with a much more limited range of frequencies, sounds, and rhythms. But the same thing happens in these projected futures of science fiction films. All of the different futures increasingly, to my eyes, look like Apple stores. You can see here in Elysium, for example, the idea of the suburbia, or maybe even an animated version of Howard's Garden City diagram, turned into a type of micro-utopia. It's a mixture of office park and artificial landscapes of the suburbs, along with, as you can see, some infrastructure to support it. This, in many ways, is a diagrammatic version, perhaps, of instant urbanism translated into space. Once we ruin planet A, then we can always go to this planet B. But even the film tells us what happens when we do that, particularly if it follows the socioeconomic and racial divides that are in many ways exaggerating their antagonisms now through the different news stories that are coming out of different countries. The Martian was obviously different than that. The Martian is a film that takes us, he's lost and trapped and needs to be rescued. But in this film, it's in the distance of Mars, and using in almost a Robinson Crusoe type of way, his ingenuity, this astronaut manages to create a false ecosystem, or we shall say an artificial, not false, ecosystem to sustain himself in an unsustainable environment, and to repurpose and to recombine different technological elements to produce new types of situations. And again, it was heavily influenced and supported by the people who were advising the film, including NASA itself, I was told, was also involved in this. And this is a thesis student project when I was a professor at RPI for the Bachelor of Architecture. Lyndon had this really clever idea of using some of that terraforming, NASA-driven propagation technology, but applying it to the American Midwest. It's a type of techno-futurism, and it's also a type of repair restorative culture of transforming the environment into a different agricultural environment. And you can see in his design here for his thesis, the representations of the different dwellings, the different technologies, again, following a particular, I guess, construction logic and aesthetic you would find in the Japanese metabolist movement, also in the different types of post-Blade Runner science fiction too, brought to bear on a real site in real time. So this is the idea of a future science or science fiction being turned into contemporary speculative design, which I think is a very helpful way to approach solving wicked problems when there's no clear pathway forward in terms of design solutions. Sometimes instead of problem solving, the good designers will actually do problem finding. And if you do that process of reframing, as Keith Dorst describes it in his book, this process of reframing from problem solving to problem finding opens up the opportunity of looking at alternative futures and alternative presents. And that takes us back to our first image and the Film Adjustment Bureau, where at any point in time, and it sounds quite existentialist, you can choose to take one of many paths. And by doing so, you set into play a whole bunch of other operations that are not inevitable, but are irreversible. And in many ways, this is the multi-track model of temporality and time that sometimes leads us into loops and coils and circuits that I think is actually a constituent part of the post-human condition. And the research I'm doing now has to do with everything from how we conceive, perceive, and live in these post-human spatial circuits, but what place architecture and the conventional techniques of ultra-minimalist architecture have to play in the development of this post-humanist world. And with that, I will end my formal presentation. Thank you. Okay. All right. I do. Bear with me 1 second. The next one will be about secret gardens and multiple ecologies. The one after that, we will look at different versions of ultra thin and high performing surface logics. Basically, the next one's about multiple ecologies, and the one after that is about ultra thin surfaces. I'll just leave it quickly at that because I have them mostly finished, but I'm still looking for some details and examples. And also want to get some references from my colleagues around the world too. So we'll just dangle those in front of people as teasers, okay? All right. Absolutely. Yes, there's a reciprocal relationship, but I was also arguing too that architecture has something to do with fashion or even automobile design and the fact that they all come out as manifestations of similar intangible culture or the most advanced forms of production that are available in that society too. So it's not simply a promiscuity of details being stolen from one discipline or another, but it's almost like intellectually drinking from the same invisible river that we start to find those correlations and those synchronous moments. Since I don't believe in coincidence, I think all of the different devices and all the technologies seem to freely communicate to each other too. So maybe that's a post-human fantasy. But the idea is that in the future, which is now in some ways, although as William Gibson said, it's not evenly distributed, those moments of the future that have arrived are already starting to influence and to rub off on other moments in time. And it's possible in a 20-minute span to be in multiple worlds. And also, if you believe the idea that we live in multiple timelines, that you have a choice, that the world is composed of decision trees, and at any one moment you can decide or not decide to do something, and it will set into motion other things. That's everything from the butterfly effect to causality. I find a lot of correlations between some of the experimental thinking in science fiction films throughout history, even going back to the earliest black and white soundless films. I find a strong correlation between some of those experimental thinking about time, space, and cognition, and correlating to those ideas around architecture and its development theoretically as well, in terms of mental ecologies, social ecologies, and even environmental ecologies. So I learn a lot from studying science fiction films, and often it's held up as a smoky mirror to where we are, pointing towards one or more possible futures that we can to some degree intervene in. But it's a huge topic. You'll never read everything written about architecture, and you probably can't read everything written about science fiction film. But you can probably, the Venn diagram of those two is actually manageable in probably a master's degree. So you could probably do it in 2 or 3 years if you want to look at the literature between them. But I'm always looking for colleagues and particularly other students who, like me, developed their master's thesis by studying a film and studying a building type and trying to produce a hybrid fusion of the two into a final project. So I'm willing to talk to people at length about that, in which science fiction films produce the weirdest buildings. But we'll save that for another time, perhaps. But thanks for the question. All right. Yeah. Yes. The left me, yeah, a master. He knew a lot more about design history than people give him credit for. But yeah, there's a published sketchbook by Sid Mead that was on most of our desks when we were undergraduate students. So the rendering techniques we were being taught in architecture school seemed too old-fashioned, so we all turned to Sid Mead and his quick temper. Yeah. No, good catch. Yeah. Environment. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's right. And as some people may know that he was the designer for all of the stage sets and the storyboards. No, I think Ridley Scott did his own storyboards, but he was the concept designer for the film Blade Runner. And so it's pervasive there. And for me, that was a foundational film that changed my understanding of the scale and rate of temporal change in the world. All right. I think we're out of time and I should let everyone go. All right. All right. Take care. All right. My pleasure. Good night, everyone.